What's up, everybody? Welcome to the post-trade deadline edition of the Pack-A-Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. A lot of angst, frustration, questions, theories, etc. around Packerland right now. With the Packers not making any moves, no trades. There were multiple trades that were made, a lot of movement. If you would have told me going into the day that there was a top-tier tight end and a top-tier wide receiver that were moved to teams in the NFC North, I would have very much expected Green Bay to be bringing in one of those two players, but alas, they did not. Before we get there, before we break down all of the trade deadline minutia and go through it in painstakingly detail, I have a feeling this is not going to be a short episode. Let's get the news and notes out of the way first. The first good news, Jordy Nelson and Josh Sitton both inducted into the Packers Hall of Fame. So that is awesome. Both super deserving. Should be a really cool induction ceremony for both of those guys. And just could not be happier for two players who were just consummate professionals as Green Bay Packers. And obviously Jordy Nelson and Josh Sitton, both instrumental to the Packers' success during their time in Green Bay. So super cool. That is the good news of the day. The roster movement of the day did not include a trade of any sort. Instead, it included the release of Patrick Taylor off the roster and the release of Kobe Jones off of the practice squad, which is somewhat surprising because they just activated him to the active roster for game day off of the practice squad last weekend. And to me, he looked better than Ladarius Hamilton or Jonathan Garvin had in similar situations. So it looked like they may have found somebody as their number 4 edge. And instead, not only did they not think enough of him to keep him around on the practice squad even, they jettisoned him entirely. So I don't know if there was some sort of incident or if they just didn't like what they saw on tape. I'm not sure why. There was nothing glaring. Pro Football Focus had a positive grade on him in minimum snaps. I had a slightly positive grade. So there was no glaring mistake on tape at first glance or second or third glance for that matter. But alas, doesn't matter all that much. Kobe Jones off the practice squad. What likely this sets up is that Kylan Hill will be added to the active roster. Patrick Taylor will likely go to the practice squad, although maybe that's not quite the foregone conclusion with Tyler Goodson already on the practice squad. We'll have to see what happens there, but great news for Kylan Hill returning, and then that will also leave the Packers with one remaining open roster spot. So those were the news and notes that did not involve the trade deadline. Nobody probably cares because everyone wants to talk about the trade deadline right now, so let's jump into that and let's get to that right away. First noteworthy, item here is Chase Claypool, right? So let's talk about that first. Chase Claypool traded to the Chicago Bears for a second-round pick, the Chicago Bears second-round pick. It has been reported by numerous sources at this point, on sides for both the Steelers and the Packers, that the Packers were involved in the Chase Claypool conversations and that they also offered a second-round pick and that the Steelers preferred the Bears second-round pick over the Packers second-round pick, understandably. And we'll see that they have the same record. So it's not like exactly an easy probably decision to make, but I think most teams would probably say, yeah, we'll take the Bears second round pick over Green Bay's, especially when you consider, okay, would you rather have the Bears with Chase Claypool in that pick or the Packers with Chase Claypool in that pick? Because if the Packers have Chase Claypool and the Bears don't, then that gap between the two even widens further. So even with Chase Claypool on the Bears, there's still a good chance that the Packers beat them out in the division. Nothing is guaranteed at this point, but I think if you're playing the odds, if you're the Steelers, you would probably rather take the Chicago Bears second round pick, which is ultimately what they did. Whether or not the Packers should have offered a second round pick for Chase Claypool, we'll get into more in just a little bit. But to me, it was very clear if you kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together from the reporting during the day. I think Justina Anderson was the one who originally said that the Packers were involved in conversations for Chase Claypool. There were reports later in the day that the Packers were the leaders in the clubhouse for the pick. There was another report that said the Chicago Bears were offered a second or made an offer and it wasn't good enough and they thought they were out. And then they raised the ante and the Steelers ultimately accepted the Bears offer. I think if you put all the pieces together, what the likely scenario here was that the Packers had probably a deal in place with the Steelers for their second round pick for Chase Claypool, probably 1-for-1. The Bears called and offered, in all likelihood, the Ravens second round pick, which they just got in exchange for Roquan Smith. And they probably heard back from the Steelers, that they actually had a better offer on the table, which right now, if you were to take the Ravens second round pick or the Packers second round pick, clearly you would take the Packers. And then it sounds like the Bears upped their ante and called back and basically said, we're going to offer our own second round pick. Again, if you're putting you're reading the tea leaves and putting the pieces together, and ultimately they say yes to that deal, rather have the Bears second round pick, understandably so, and Chase Claypool becomes a member of the Chicago Bears instead of the Green Bay Packers. Meanwhile, the Minnesota Vikings and Detroit Lions have a rare in-division trade, although it is their second of the year. Remember, they did the big draft day trade as well. And this time, TJ Hawkinson goes from the Lions to the Vikings with Irv Smith Jr. out for the Vikings. They felt like they needed a tight end. I would have been shocked if the Vikings didn't do something, because they're very much in the conversation for one of the top teams in the NFC. They're probably, maybe first of all, the Eagles and the Cowboys could beat up on each other, and the Vikings could get into that number 1 seed, as much as we don't want to think about that. So it makes sense for them to be buying. Makes sense probably for the Lions to still capitalize and get draft picks for players. They're still very much in rebuild mode, and they probably are starting to realize that even though Jared Goff's played well at times, they're going to have ammunition to probably go up and get a quarterback at some point. So I think this deal makes sense for them, but a key tight end goes from a division team in the Lions to the Vikings to help their playoff run. So as mentioned, if you would have told me that a key wide receiver and key tight end moved into teams in the NFC North, and one of them was not the Packers, I definitely would have been surprised. And I know all of the talk after the trade deadline passes, and there's a plethora of moves that are made throughout the league, and none of them involve the Green Bay Packers. And once again, the Green Bay Packers make a fairly significant offer for Chase Claypool and are in on the conversations, but once again, always the bridesmaid, never the bride, and don't get the deal done and finish second in a deal, similarly to Khalil Mack, amongst multiple other trades that they've been in the conversations with in the past, and don't get anything done. I can sense and feel and understand an extreme level of frustration within Packerland, Packer fandom, Packers Nation, whatever you want to call them. And I get it. I understand the frustration. And having a day where you have an opportunity maybe to improve your team, and you see all these other teams that are playoff contenders improving their team, and Green Bay, who's struggling right now and needs a shot in the arm, doesn't do anything, that certainly as a fan can be very, very frustrating. So I get that. All right. So before we discuss any other trades, whether they should have done the Claypool trade, what they could have done, should have done, etc., let's take a quick time out here. It is time for Real Talk with Andy Herman. And what I want to talk about here is the state of the Green Bay Packers, because in order to understand the trade deadline and what Green Bay should or should not have done, we need to have a very extreme, firm grasp on what the state of the Green Bay Packers currently is. They are 3-5, 3 wins, 5 losses. In the NFC right now, 14 of the 16 teams have a record of 3-5 or better. There are only 2 teams that have a record in the NFC worse than the Packers. Technically, if you do all the playoff seeding stuff, they are 11th right now. They need to bolt up to number 7 in order to get into the playoffs, of course. But there are only 2 teams that have worse records. So a bunch of tiebreakers, and a lot of the games coming up will be huge factors in deciding who's ultimately going to be able to make it to the playoffs. And Green Bay has some extremely tough games coming up, including games against the Cowboys, the Titans, the Eagles, etc. And not like this Lions game on the road, even against a bad Lions team. That's not a guarantee. This is going to be their 3rd straight road game. They are in their 5th stadium in 5 days, and the Lions have consistently and constantly been pesky against the Packers. They won't have TJ Hawkinson. That should help. But this is a very tough stretch that Green Bay has been going through. They have lost 4 consecutive games, and they have really given you nothing, and I mean nothing, in the last 4 games that you could grasp onto and point to and be like, yeah, that's a team that's competing for a Super Bowl right now. The only thing that we also need to mention here is that in favor of maybe making a trade is that while there are 14 teams that are 3-5 or better, you can also make a very strong argument that the NFC is just really bad right now. And really, as of right now, the Cowboys and the Eagles probably going to make it in. The Vikings in the NFC North. Somebody's going to win the South. Somebody's going to win the West. So you've got 5 teams, and you've got the Giants that are, really high up on that list right now. They could easily come back down to earth, so I wouldn't just wrap them up as a number 6 seed, but they also have the tiebreaker with the Packers, which is not great. The Commanders have a tiebreaker with the Packers, which is not great. And in the meantime, you have other teams like the Rams, like the 49ers. 49ers already go out and get a Christian McCaffrey that are going to try to go and get into the playoffs. Tampa Bay is probably going to make a run at some point. The Rams likely make a run at some point. So Green Bay is fighting a very tough fight just to get into the playoffs. And there's only going to be so many spots for those teams that are 3-5, or at least in a similar situation as the Packers right now. And again, there is nothing that you can point to in the last 4 games, or quite frankly, even before that. Go to the Bailey Zappi Patriots game, go to the, to any of the games, the Vikings game in week 1. There is nothing that you can point to that you would say, yes, that team is ready to compete right now. And that's just a real, honest, harsh truth that I think we all have to come to the conclusion of, is this team, as of today, maybe they get a win in Detroit and things just start to spiral in the right direction rather than spiraling in the wrong direction, with which things have been doing. That's always within the realm of possibility. As I've said, there will probably be some team that gets hot at the right time, makes the playoffs, and makes a run deep into the postseason. It happens almost every single year. Could that be the Packers? Sure, maybe. Is it within the realm of possibility? Yes. Is it probable? Certainly not. And when you look at this team right now, not only do they not look like a competitive football team, at least when it comes to playoffs, Super Bowl, etc., you can also just look offense, defense, special teams, scheme, coaching. There are issues and concerns with all of it. So you look at the offense, right? Aaron Rodgers has not been as accurate, has not been as mobile. His arm hasn't been as good, and he's got an injured thumb. A.J. Dillon's taken a step back at running back. The wide receiver room we know is inconsistent at best and probably needs a significant upgrade. Tight end, you have a really good blocking tight end in Mercedes Lewis, who's also getting very up there in age. And you've got Josiah DeGuara, who's coming into his own as an H-back. But you've got Robert Tonyan, who's not quite back from his ACL, is starting to put some good games together, has looked better as a blocker, but can't consistently threaten the middle of the field and up the seam, and can't make plays after the catch, which is going to be an issue. Your offensive line has been shuffled, and they're trying to figure out what offensive line is actually going to work for this team. David Bakhtiari, you don't know if he's going to be available in any given week. Elton Jenkins looks like a third or a fourth of the player that he was prior to his ACL injury so far. Josh Myers hasn't taken a step. Royce Newman hasn't taken a step. Yosh Nijman's playing a new position. John Runyan Jr. actually looks like he's taken a step back. Zach Tom needs to put on weight. That's just on the offensive side. On the defensive side of the ball, you have one legitimate true pass rusher in Rashawn Gary. Preston Smith is inconsistent. Kenny Clark is a good pass rusher, but he's, as Ben Fennell has noted, he's always like a 1/10 of a second just slower than he needs to be. That's not a diss on him. Kenny Clark is amazing, but he's never going to be that quick pass rusher that just gets 10, 12, 15 sacks in a season. He's going to be that slow burn, push the pocket, and hope that those edge rushers coming around are going to be able to get there quicker than he probably does. Again, not a knock on Kenny Clark. He's phenomenal, but your one true consistent pass rusher is Rashawn Gary. The defensive line has not been as advertised so far and has had great inconsistencies, hasn't stopped the run, and even Kenny Clark's coming off his worst game of the season. Your linebackers have not lived up to expectations. Devondre Campbell looks much closer to the Falcons-Cardinals version of Devondre Campbell rather than the 2021 Packers version of Devondre Campbell. Quay Walker showing signs, but going to need time. Jair Alexander finally played his best game of the season, but has been a bit inconsistent prior to that. Rasul Douglas playing out of position and probably playing a system in a lot of zone defense that is not perfect for his skill set. Eric Stokes has no interest in stopping the run and is okay in coverage, not a great zone corner. They're playing a lot of zone. Adrian Amos looks a step and a half slower. Darnell Savage is not a starting caliber safety. The special team still remains a massive issue. And if you're looking for a change in defensive coordinator or any coordinator, Matt LaFleur has made it abundantly clear that they are not making changes to the coaching staff. And who are you going to sign at this point of the season anyway? Even if you sign a Jerry Gray, or not sign, but put him in the defensive coordinator position, he's leading a group currently that might be the most underachieving group of the entire team right now, and consistently has issues with communication and breakdowns on their side of things. So, suffice it to say, there are some serious flaws and issues with this team. And yes, maybe a DJ Moore, a Chase Claypool, a Jerry Jeudy helps one piece of that, the wide receiver room. Maybe. But there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case. And those players would have to learn the system and, integrate themselves within the offense. I've said this in the past and I'll say it again. I've talked to players, Taylor Mertz, the former Badger offensive lineman. When Matt LaFleur first got hired, I talked to him, and he played with Matt LaFleur in Tennessee as obviously an offensive lineman. And I asked him point blank, what's the hardest position to learn in Matt LaFleur's offense? And he said wide receiver, unquestionably. So you can't always just add this guy in. We've seen with the rookies how difficult this is of a system this is to learn and be on the same page. And then you also know you have to learn a second system because Aaron Rodgers has his own system of things going in. So if you think that Chase Claypool or Jerry Jeudy or any of these guys are just going to come in and be a plug and play, this isn't baseball. This isn't like, hey, go play shortstop and hit the ball. You've got to know the system. You've got to know the checks. You've got to know the calls. And we have seen receivers come in. It's like Sammy Watkins has had trouble this year, learning things. And we're in week 8. So if you just think that some of these younger wide receivers who are ultra talented and could certainly help in some capacity are just going to come in and immediately know the offense and know the checks, and that Aaron Rodgers is going to trust them and throw them the ball with consistency, I don't know what to tell you. That's just probably not going to be the case. And even if it was, even if Chase Claypool comes in and plays his best brand of football and helps you on offense and helps you be a bigger threat down the field, he's got a big body that you can use in the red zone. Even if all of that stuff comes to fruition, it still doesn't answer all of those questions that we went over previously. And listen, I like a lot of the players on this team. I like a lot of the coaches on this team. And I do think that there is an upside here that has not been even close to being reached. But there are too many red flags and too many fires right now to think that one player or one transaction is just going to solve all of it. Now, if they had wanted to add a player, go in that direction, I think that they certainly were within their rights to do so, and maybe it could have helped. Maybe it would have been the kickstart that the team needed. That's within the realm of possibility. But I think one of the things that you could be in the worst situation of doing right here is taking one bad mistake and compounding it by making more mistakes on top of it to try to cover for your initial mistake. And what I mean by that is this team made the wrong decision in the offseason. And we're not going to go through it verbatim today because that will be another episode for another day. And it could probably be about a 10-part series at this point. But this team made the wrong decision in the offseason to try to keep the window open. There's just no two ways around it. They had an opportunity to trade Rodgers, and Rodgers would have had to have been a part of that conversation as well. But there was already the flirtations with Denver. Denver wanted him. And if Green Bay probably just gave a little nudge and being like, yeah, I think it's time, I think he probably goes to Denver and doesn't think twice about it, especially once he learns that Devontae Adams is going to the Raiders and there's nothing he can do about that either. So, and yes, it has been confirmed by numerous outlets that Aaron Rodgers was the Broncos' key target, and that they pivoted to Russell Wilson after Rodgers decided he was going to stay in Green Bay. Again, another podcast for another day, but they had the opportunity out there. And listen, you could say, Andy, that's with the benefit of hindsight, and you've got to keep the window open. If you remember, and this is not me taking victory laps, trust me, there was nothing that I would have loved more than me to be wrong and people being able to shove the video in my face and put me on Old Takes Exposed and the Packers win the Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers in 2022 and haha, Andy, you're an idiot. I would have been thrilled. I would have been beyond thrilled. But the video prior to the season, it was time to trade Aaron Rodgers. And I talked about when you open a window and when the window is closing, and you have to be very careful of, knowing when to close one window and trying to open another. Green Bay got that wrong, and there's no two ways about it right now. So this is not me saying it with the benefit of hindsight. I said it prior to the start of the season. I believed it at the time. Clearly, I believe it even more right now. But they made the mistake in the offseason of saying we can keep this thing going for one more season. And in doing so, it hasn't worked out. They're 3-5. They're clearly not in a place to compete as of right now. Again, I'll say it one more time. Hopefully that turns around, and hopefully we can play this on Old Takes Exposed as well, and you can throw it in my face again. That would be awesome. But it's not going great. It's not trending in the right direction. They made the mistake, and probably the worst thing that they could possibly do is say, you know what? It hasn't worked so far, but if we just do a little bit more, maybe it could. And we're going to trade some draft picks away to get some more players in, and it ultimately doesn't solve the problem. And you're ultimately now ended up in probably just about the same position with less draft picks into the future. At some point, you're going to have to do a rebuild, and not having those picks would just kick things further down the road, which could be extremely disastrous and could be already, but could be disastrous if things go extremely sour and you start throwing draft picks away for this one season. So there were three options, clearly, that Brian Gutekunst had at his disposal. He could have bought at the trade deadline, which it sounds like he tried to do with trying to get Chase Claypool for a second-round pick. He was trying to add players at the trade deadline. The second option would have been to sell, and the third option would have been to stand pat. Clearly, his intentions were to buy. Clearly, his intentions were not firm enough and strong enough that it was worth going above the second round pick. And I think that's the right decision, by the way. I wouldn't have done their own second round pick for Claypool. I would have understood it. I would have been excited about it, because who wouldn't be excited about a new weapon for your offense? And maybe it does kickstart things. But I think if you look at it objectively, that probably would have been a bit rich for Chase Claypool's services. But clearly he was trying to buy to some extent. And what that would have done, I think, to Green Bay, I think it would have given a team a little bit of a shot in the arm that desperately needs a shot in the arm right now. There is rumors of, discontent in the locker room. This is a team that's lost 4 games in a row. This is a team that could use a spark from anywhere you could possibly give it to them. They've played in 4 stadiums in the last 4 weeks. They're about to play in their 5th. And you can just tell it feels like the weight of the world is on this entire franchise right now. And maybe, just maybe, you add somebody like a Claypool or somebody else, and it just gives a little bit of a jolt. And maybe you go into Detroit with that little boost of energy, and maybe you get a win. And maybe that just one win is the small domino that pushes the bigger domino, that pushes the huge domino at the end. Who knows? So that could have been an option of what they did. And it sounds like they tried. It didn't work out, and they ultimately stand pat. Could they have sold? Probably would have leaned in that direction, but you are in a very difficult spot, because you have to think of, like, all right, who could you sell that is probably going to be moving on from the team next year, that has a reasonable contract this year, that you could actually get some draft picks back for? And, like, the name that probably makes the most sense is Aaron Jones. And talk about just a dagger to the team. Like, you are not only trading away Aaron Jones for some draft picks, you are completely deflating this entire team for the remainder of the season, and the fan base and everyone. Trading away Aaron Jones, the one player on offense that's just balling out and playing out of his mind and doing everything he can to keep this team afloat, you trade him away, and you could argue that that's what the team needs, is to be bad and get a better draft pick and stuff like that. It's easier said than done. This isn't Madden. And making that sort of decision has a extreme trickle-down effect into that locker room, with a lot of unhappy players and players who are probably completely checked out for the remainder of the season. And then you start going like the rest of the roster. Like, you can say, well, they should trade Darnell Savage. Darnell Savage's contract is to the point, with him having a guaranteed contract next year, with them picking up his 5th-year option, that not only does he probably not have value, you might need to attach a draft pick to Darnell Savage to have somebody take on a player who's playing really poorly and has a guaranteed contract next year. So that is not an easy, we're going to flip Darnell Savage, get something in return. You might have to attach something to him. And then you've got a bunch of young players that you probably don't want to jettison at this point. You could say, like, Amari Rodgers. Well, okay, if you don't want Amari Rodgers, trust me, there is probably not a team that's willing to do much for his services either. Maybe you get like a conditional 7th, or maybe you take back somebody else's garbage in a swap. And we're seeing for the first time that Amari Rodgers is actually having some usefulness at wide receiver, and you don't really have a returner to take his place, as we have seen. So you're probably just better off, rather than some conditional 7th round pick, maybe, to just hang on to him at this point. And that goes for a lot of the younger players, even the ones that are struggling. And then it's tough to find a trade. I don't know that anyone would have much interest in Adrian Amos right now. I don't know that anyone would have interest in Devondre Campbell and his contract that you just signed. Maybe you could find a taker for a Jerron Reed, but like some of these, even if you find takers, you're talking about late 7th round picks, and the ROI just isn't good enough to like tank on the season and sell on the season just to get some super late picks for next year. And the ones that you would get value on, probably like an Aaron Jones, is just a dagger to the entire heart of the team, the organization, the fan base, etc. So what ultimately ends up happening is Brian Gutekunst tries to get something at the trade deadline, probably has a limit as to how far he wants to go, probably was killing him already to try to even get in the conversation for giving a true 2nd round pick. Also probably noting that if he was going to do something like this, he probably erred and made the mistake in not doing it in 2020 or 2021 when they had legitimate chances to win the Super Bowl, not just trying to get somebody to kickstart your team in a team that's clearly on the decline and is 3-5 and is 11th place in the conference at the moment. So there was clearly a limit to what he was wanting to do. So he ultimately doesn't make the trade. He ultimately doesn't sell because of all the things that we just mentioned. And you end up with what might be the worst case scenario, as much as I understand it and probably could have expected it. And that's just standing pat, because we know that this team hasn't been very good. They now, to some extent, if I were the players, I would probably have been expecting like, okay, things haven't been good, but the trade deadline's coming up and maybe we're going to get some reinforcements. Like maybe we're going to get some help, especially if you're an Aaron Rodgers, right? And they don't get the help. They don't get the reinforcements. Like Rodgers was just talking on McAfee of like, hey, maybe we'll have some news to break while I'm on your show. That didn't happen. So I guarantee you to some extent, this team was probably looking at Goody and being like, all right, does this guy still believe in us? Like, are we going to get some reinforcements, or is this pretty much it? And that's probably the message that this sends now to the team, is that, yeah, we are not really going to get you reinforcements. And maybe, and I'm sure the messaging from the team is going to be, we like the players that we have on our team right now. That's an easier sell if the story isn't out there that you tried to get Chase Claypool and you fell short to the Bears, who aren't even competing right now. So this is going to be a very tough sell. Now, the question that I would want to ask Brian Gutekunst is, do you think this team can win the Super Bowl? And there's 3 answers to this. There's yes, no, or I don't know. If the answer is yes, you can win the Super Bowl, then you have to do something. If you legitimately think the answer is yes, that you can win the Super Bowl this year, you have to make a move, right? There's no two ways. Like, you could literally be looking at an offseason where Aaron Rodgers retires. Maybe David Bakhtiari is never back to himself. Maybe he decides, especially if Rodgers retires, maybe he decides to retire. Your salary cap is an absolute nightmare. And your window is not only just like shut, it is slam shut, never to be open for the foreseeable future. Like, that is a possibility. So if you think the answer is yes, you can win a Super Bowl, then you have to do something. If the answer is no, if you don't think this team can win a Super Bowl, then you really need to gain some draft capital back for the players. And I just talked about it's tough to do that, but it's almost worse not to do that. Because if you don't think your team can win the Super Bowl and you're just going to chill on players that you know you're going to have to release next year because of salary cap issues, just so you don't have to maybe look like the bad guy, or maybe so that like some of the, like, that's a bad look too. So if the answer is yes, you have to buy. If the answer is no, you have to sell. If the answer is you're not sure, that's not a great answer from your general manager, first of all. But then I can understand standing pat, and I do get that this team is in a bit of no man's land right now. But I don't know, like, standing pat seems to me to be probably the worst case scenario for this franchise. You either have to take one more shot at it, or you have to start rebuilding for the future, because this window, as of right now, with the team and the roster that you have, doesn't seem to be open at the moment. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here is that this is very clearly a seller's market. And if you would just look at all of these trades and I mentioned this on Pack-A-Day Live, there's maybe a couple of the running back ones, like the James Robinson trade that it's a 6th-round pick that turns into a 5th. There were a couple of the running back trades that I was like, all right, if you're a competing team, yeah, like those are easy trades that you can help your team to some extent without having to trade away anything major in the future. There were a couple of those trades specifically for running backs, and I'm like, yeah, those make sense. But I think if you were just looking at this as a team, like if you were starting a team today and you were saying, if you could either have the player that the contending team acquired, your Bradley Chubb, your Chase Claypool, all the TJ Hawkinson, etc., you can have that player, or you can have the haul that the team that traded the player away got in return. If you were just a neutral team and starting over from scratch today, and I'm clearly not saying like they would be a competitive team or whatever, but I'm just saying as a neutral observer, if you could have one of those two things to start your team with, you would clearly choose the haul that the teams got in return. This was a seller's market, and teams had to pay a pretty premium price for the services of TJ Hawkinson, Chase Claypool, and Bradley Chubb. So I can understand if Brian Gutekunst had a line in the sand to say, hey, we're not willing to go to that level, to that extent. I get it. I understand it. But again, that is still going to send a message. And I don't know. I probably, there's none of those deals that I look at and I'm like, yeah, that would have been a really great deal and it was a fair price. This was a seller's market, and the teams that were willing to sell got the king's ransom that they needed to make those moves in return. And I can understand why Brian Gutekunst probably didn't want to go above and beyond. The other thing I'll say here is that just look at the players that were available for trade. And I'm sure there were maybe a couple other ones that could have been available that probably the other teams were asking for way too much because they didn't get traded, right? But if you could add, two players that would really help this team, you're probably that were actually dealt, you're probably adding Chase Claypool and TJ Hawkinson, right? So let me ask you this. They could have gotten probably Chase Claypool and TJ Hawkinson. They probably would have had to, trade away, because a 2nd-round pick went for Hawkinson. So it was a 2nd and a 3rd for Hawkinson. So now they don't have their 2nd-round draft pick available. They probably would have to give their 1st and then maybe got something a little bit back in return from the Steelers for Claypool. But let's just say they traded away their 1st, their 2nd, and a 2024 3rd, which is probably what it would have taken to get those two players. They would have gotten Claypool, Hawkinson, a 2023 4th, and a 2024 4th. Say something like that. All right, so you're saying you're going to take the Rams approach, F them picks, we want the players. Is that good enough? Like if you would have added, like it would have been exciting, right? Packers add TJ Hawkinson and Chase Claypool. You've got an offense that consists of Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon at running back, Rodgers at quarterback, Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Yosh Nijman. At tight end, you've got TJ Hawkinson and Robert Tonyan with Mercedes Lewis, Josiah DeGuara at H-back. You've got Chase Claypool, Alan Lazard, Romeo Dobbs. You can bring in a Christian Watson. It's Randall Cobb when he's healthy. Like that sounds on paper like a pretty good team. But we know that this offensive line is struggling even with the new configuration. We haven't really seen Bakhtiari and Jenkins together on the left side yet, so maybe there's some hope there. But this defense is still 22nd in the league and extremely underperforming, and the special teams hasn't turned around. So even if you could get the two best players that would have helped this team the most, I'm personally not sold that would have been it. Like that would have done it. That would have been the two players that puts them over the top. And if that's not the case, are you not better off just either standing pat or selling? So again, it doesn't fix your offensive line. It doesn't fix your special teams. It doesn't fix your defense. It doesn't fix your tackling. And where does that ultimately leave your Super Bowl win probability? And that might sound like a fake thing, like who cares? Like just go out and compete and see if you can win. But NFL general managers are they're basically like insurance risk advisors or like a casino. They're constantly evaluating the risk, the reward, the probabilities. And if giving up a ton of your future to get a tight end and a wide receiver who are good, but probably overvalued based on their previous draft position and, a couple of big plays here and there, it probably raises your win probability enough to get you in the playoffs. But I don't think it significantly increases their Super Bowl win probability. And it certainly still doesn't put you in the conversation with the Chiefs and the Bills of the world. And that's a really tough selling point if you're going to give up a bunch of your future assets and you're not even guaranteed a playoff spot. And the other thing that I will add here is that even if you add those two players, you're still probably, you still have too many shatter points on your team. And what I mean by that is you go out and you add those two players and you sell a bunch of your future draft picks for some new players now, and you get in and you're trending in the right direction. Let's even say they go on a winning streak. Maybe they beat the Cowboys. Maybe they beat the Eagles and it really like kickstarts them. Well, you still are probably in a position where if at the wrong time, Aaron Rodgers, Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, Jair Alexander, any of them go out for the remainder of the year, your season's probably still kaput, like it's over. And David Bakhtiari probably on that list too. They're just not good enough on the offensive line. And we don't even know if he's going to play week to week. So even if you add those two players and even if things start trending in the right direction, you still have scenarios where an injury or two here or there could completely logjam your season and make it that you're not even competing. And now you've taken so much from your future assets to even put this team together, and now you even have less to show for it. Like, there is real legitimate risk and concern in doing something like that. And I'll wrap up here with a couple things. And like I said, I knew this was going to be a long episode. Let's start with Chase Claypool. Doug Farrar, who, if you're not familiar, follow him on Twitter. He's amazing. But he said quite succinctly, and I agree with him, I do not believe for 1 second that Chase Claypool would have worked in Green Bay's offense. Chase Claypool, a little bit of a freelancer at times, not always on the same page with the rest of the offense, can make some boneheaded decisions. There's a lot of talent there, but expecting him to come in and master this offense and get on the same page with Rodgers, there would have been a great deal of frustration that would have come with adding him in that. Also, Farrar, if you're just thinking like he's agreeing with everything Green Bay did and is thinking like, yeah, he's just saying that because but whatever. Like, he had Green Bay on the trade deadline loser list in his article. So make sure to check that out. Doug's the best. But he was very adamant that he didn't think that Claypool would fit in Green Bay. And Ben Fennell, who I trust a ton as well, basically said something, or at least inferred something similar when he said, I know like the Bears fans were all excited about getting Claypool. And he's like, the Bears fans are going to hate that trade by like this weekend. Because again, Claypool not always on the same page with everything else that's going on with the rest of the team. So that may not have worked out very great. The other thing I want to mention, and Ben Fennell tweeted this out, and I agree with this as well. And again, we'll save a lot of this for another episode on another day. Maybe we'll bring Ben back on. But he said on Twitter, and quote here, it's tough to fix 18 to 24 months of questionable roster decisions in one trade deadline. This Packers roster isn't good enough. And he said, unfortunately, and the free agency acquisitions on offense haven't been impactful, and the collective draft haul hasn't processed enough impact players. And he's right. And he's true. And again, these are harsh realities. And I would love nothing more than to be sitting here. Again, Packers sweatshirt, Packers background, Packer fan. I would love nothing more than to tell you things are going in the right direction and everything's going to be fine. It's just really tough to look at the tape and look at where this team is and look at the red flags and look at the issues and be like, grit your teeth and say things are going to be fine. It's not. The things are in a little bit of rough shape right now, and just one move, borrowing from the future to try to fix the leak, is not going to work. And if you listen to, and I'm not talking about me here, I want to be very clear, but if you listen to some of the really smart people that have studied this and broke it down and watched it, I don't think there's anyone that I know that thinks, yeah, they're just a player away. And that's just the honest, harsh truth of where Green Bay is at the moment. As much pain as that brings me to say, and as much as I wish that wasn't the case, I believe it to be true. And that's what I'm always going to shoot you as straight as I possibly can. And that's where I think things are right now. I don't even know if I want to go into all of this, but I think it's fair to ask what the plan was for the Packers this offseason. And again, we'll save that a lot for another day. But I think to some extent, it was clear that they wanted to bring in some different options at wide receiver. They thought that the offensive line was going to work out. They thought they were going to build this amazing defense. And just none of it's really worked out the way that they expected. And I also think that there's probably a sense with Gutekunst of like, rather than going all in the offseason with a big wide receiver acquisition, why don't they attack it via the draft, bring in a guy like Sammy Watkins, see if he can have like a Devondre Campbell type of year where he just busts out of nowhere. and then you reevaluate at the trade deadline. And if your team is, 6-2, 7-1 at the trade deadline, and you think you're a player away, maybe you do go out and get a Chase Claypool or a Jerry Jeudy, or you go aggressive at that point. But it has not been that case, and the plan hasn't worked, and everything's kind of gone to crap since then. And again, we'll talk about that on another day, but it's tough to say exactly what the plan was, but whatever it was, it has not gone according to plan. And I think one of the things that Green Bay is clearly going to be frustrated with when they look back at everything, if you're willing to give a second round pick right now for Chase Claypool, where were those moves in 2020 and 2021 when you were legitimately trying to compete? I know they were trying to go after Stephon Gilmore, and we can make the argument that not getting Gilmore ended up being a blessing in disguise because Douglas played better than Gilmore for the good part of last season. But if you think now that trading a second round pick for a Chase Claypool is in the best interest of your team, I promise you it was in a lot better interest in 2020 and 2021 to go out and get a really big player at the trade deadline and to help those teams try to get over the hump, rather than it would be in 2022. I mentioned this to Zach Cruz on Twitter. Like, it would have almost been more frustrating if Green Bay, if this was the year of all the years when they were extremely competitive and in the race to be a Super Bowl champion team, if this was the year that they did something at the trade deadline, it almost would have been, like I said, insulting and a kick to the gut when you've had these Super Bowl contending teams that you didn't go all in on and make a trade at the deadline. But the 3-5 Packers coming off 4 losses is the team that you ultimately decide that you want to make that deal with. So yeah, Bill Huber had a great article on the topic. He said they've been really good at being really good. They've been terrible at being great. And he's right. Another really good article that I highly recommend. Make sure to check that out over on SI. He summed up the trade deadline in extremely sound and realistic fashion. So I recommend you checking that out. But yeah, season's not over. Reinforcements didn't come that I'm sure the players were hoping for, that I'm sure a lot of fans were hoping for. As mentioned earlier, there's rumors of some discontent in the locker room. We'll see what this team is made of and what changes they can make moving forward. Right now, the old players are looking old. The young players aren't developing as expected. And things are a little bit bleak right now. And it is what it is. As I said the other day, I think it's time to adjust expectations a little bit. I think it's time to enjoy the journey and hope for the best and see what comes out of this situation and scenario. There's 9 games left in the regular season. They can go 0-9, they can go 9-0. And it's their own destiny. It's their own decisions. We know unequivocally that there is talent on this team. Almost everyone on this roster, barring the rookies, I guess at least, but almost everyone on this roster, we have seen play a brand of football that is exponentially better than the brand of football that Green Bay is playing right now. We've seen Matt LaFleur do phenomenal jobs, specifically in the regular season with coaching these teams. We have seen Aaron Rodgers be the MVP in back-to-back seasons the last 2 years. We have seen a lot of these players play really great football. They're not right now. Can they get that turned around? Can they get it going in the right direction? And if not, what does Green Bay do to start looking at the youth of this team and seeing what they can do to hopefully fix these problems moving forward? That's going to do it for me today. Long episode. Hope you enjoyed. If you made it all the way through, thank you. I didn't want to make these 45 minutes by any means, but some days you're going to go long, and some days there's a lot to talk about. Today was certainly one of those days. Not meant to be negative. I love the Green Bay Packers. I hope nothing but the best for them. It's just my view of where the team is at right now. And I've been wrong before, and I will be very, very glad if I'm wrong in this given instance, and will gladly eat my words if that is the case. Because I really want them to do well, and I really want to see this team make another run at it. And I don't want them to end with 2 Super Bowls in the Favre Rodgers era, as much as those 2 Super Bowls were amazing and I wouldn't trade them for anything in the world. I don't want to see that window, closed finally. Even if they would have done the deal in the offseason, there's a pain that comes with that, to seeing that window closed. And there could be a lot more pain in trying to open a new one. That does it for me. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate you as always. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.